Okay, so this is a 5-10-25 game at MGM National Harbor. It's listed as a 5-10, but it is always 5-10 with a mandatory 25.
So in
Um,
Washington D.C. slash Virginia, right?
yes, right.
Okay.
Mhm. So these games are played eight-handed.
Hmm.
Uh, I have about 3,800 bucks, but I am not the effective stack.
Okay.
There are two other players in this hand. The main villain is only $1,400 deep, so effective stack's 1,400.
Okay. I am happy that you're using that term correctly. Effective sex.
You're welcome.
So,
So
okay.
all right, so I'm in the 25
Okay.
with 10 of clubs, eight of clubs.
Okay.
The low jack. Let me back up here. The Because this is listed as a 5-10 game,
Hmm.
it's capped at a $2,500 buy-in.
Okay.
So the standard open as it plays 5-10-25 is a little smaller than normal. So the standard open is $65.
Well,
Uh,
let me interject here too. This is the best. So, we had Peter on stay in school a couple of months ago. This structure of like 5-10 mandatory 20 or 5-10 mandatory 25 with a cap at 100 BBs is really one of the most profitable games that you can find. I don't know how good this game is, but in LA, that 5-10-20 Hollywood Park game with a 2,500 cap was gold. And whenever they fucked around with it and made it uncapped, they ruined it because there are some players with egos that will not play in a capped game. And when you take a look at this, it's big money and you're doing stuff to like have these guys not play in the game, some of the biggest winning players, and it's an overall profitable situation. So,
yes, especially on the weekends, Friday, Saturday, this game is fantastic.
yeah.
That room also runs a 10 quarter game, which plays 10 quarter 50,
Uh-huh.
and it's uncapped. So when that game is
Yep.
running,
I was going to say,
this game is amazing.
this is your bread and butter when to play in this game when that uncapped game is running.
Correct.
Yep.
So in this hand, the low jack opens to 65, which again is the standard open.
Okay.
The big blind, who is the main villain in the hand,
Okay.
calls, and
Okay.
then I call in the 25 with the 10-8 of clubs.
How deep is the low jack, by the way?
I did not record this.
Okay.
I could say that the main villain, the big blind, was one of the smaller stacks at the table.
Mm-hmm.
I had about 3,800. I was one of the larger stacks, so he was probably somewhere in the middle.
Because I
But
think you can throw in some squeezes here with the middle blind calling. I mean, obviously you want to do it with better hands, and like if you had 10-9 suited, I think might even be a slam dunk squeeze.
I
And
would absolutely do that with
yeah,
10-9 suited. Yeah.
anytime you've got this three blind structure, and then you're trying to leverage this guy to your right. So again, 10-8, I'd rather have 10-9 suited, but I think that you could, some of the time here. I mean, probably more often than not, it's a call. I mean, I can get on board with that, but okay.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yep. So I do call,
Mhm.
and we are looking at a pot of about $200 going to the flop.
Okay.
All right. So the flop comes down 10 of spades, nine of clubs,
Hmm.
seven of spades.
10 of spades, 9 of clubs, 7 of spades, and you have 10-8 of clubs. So
Yep.
open-ended top pair and a backdoor flush draw, right?
Yeah. Pretty
Yep.
solid hand.
Yep.
As soon as this flop came down and the big blind checks,
Hmm.
I was immediately thinking that I was going to check raise the low jack. Um, and unfortunately, I didn't get the chance because the flop checks through.
So, we don't talk about sometimes like developing a leading range here in a multi-way pot. It's somewhat of a complex spot. And here's the times that I might develop a leading range. In situations where you don't want to blow off a very, very thick value hand from somebody that you think might be capable of bet folding. So like say you flopped a set or a straight here or like top two or something like that, right? And also along with times when the player might realize how bad a board it might be for him and doesn't bet, checks back and overpair. And then it's like, well, how do you sort of balance that? Well, I think I might have a leading range here with your hand Your hand has a bunch of equity. I like the front door nature also too of this particular board where, first of all, if you bet, if the low jack doesn't have anything, he's just going to fold. Okay. Now you're in position against the other guy, as opposed to like allowing a free card to sort of just come off where there's a lot of sticky cards, right? But the thing is that even if the low jack calls, you have so many sort of good cards, I think, to put him into a spot with that front door out there. I mean, obviously, I'm gonna, you have it, and then you'd be surprised. One of the best case scenarios that actually can happen if you were to lead with a hand like this and the low jack called and you're like, okay, he's got an overpair, is if top pair pairs with trips, because he'd be like, oh, you're not leading out here with the 10. I like the front door spade nature of repping that. An 8, a 6, of course, a 6 makes your hand. A jack also makes your hand, but I think that I might develop some of those hands, obviously with a leading range, and then to be consistent with that, we might do it with some draws too, although I like sort of the exploitative max fold equity line of like, ace 8 of spades, check raise. Just a thought. I don't know if you considered leading.
It's definitely something that I thought of, but just considering the way this game was playing and there were a lot of continuation bets happening, I was just kind of hoping that that would happen here and I'd be able to take advantage of it. What do you think of check raising this if the low jack were to bet?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it would be, it's one of those ones where you're attacking him, right? But I mean, I would prefer to do that against somebody. If we're going to be attacking the board, it's obviously slightly better to do that actually against an early position raiser. In the sense, people would be, why? Because he's going to have pairs. Well, I'm going to assume that people aren't going to bet off here with nothing. But the later position that somebody opens from, the more hands they could actually have to connect with this board. Whereas, and I did a whole, I mean, this kind of fit into the podcast that I did last week. I don't know if you caught that, Brian, with
I did.
Double barreling against the big blind and single raise pots, meaning that we're the pre-flop raiser in the field, single raise pots, big blind calls. What cards do we double barrel? And what I wanted to drive home in that episode was that we get to double barrel far more turn cards when we have a wider opening range in late position than in an early opening range. So it's similar type of thing where he's not going to have the thick nut hands from an earlier configuration. Versus, I mean, not that the low jack, I mean, low jack is sort of in between, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, if you were to do that, obviously you want to, rep the front door and you got to know that you're going to have to bluff on an 8 too, right?
Yep. That was the plan.
Yeah.
But it didn't happen and it checked through.
Right. Checks through. Okay. Yep.
So the turn comes down the deuce of clubs, which gives me obviously piles more equity here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the big blind checks. And at this point, I'm thinking that I got to start putting money in. I don't think the big blind is checking twice with any kind of a thick value hand, a set, a straight, even probably 2 pair. He's betting here. So I bet 150.
Yeah, that's interesting because I would go much, much smaller here. Like, I don't know. Well, depending on how the low jack structures his sort of flop c-bet range, I mean, there's 2 things that could happen here, right? The low jack has you beat and he's playing super cautiously. Or you just have the best hand and you have the entire board covered here. So, you'd want to get like, I that's why I think I might bet like 50 or 75 here. It just kind of seems like you get the best hand. There isn't a whole lot to protect against. I mean, going 150 here, what's the purpose of that bet? Because is that ever going to get called by a worse hand when you bet 150 here?
I think that there's a lot of flush draws that might call me here.
But I mean, you have the back door.
Mm-hmm.
So the guy didn't bet the front door. Not
Right.
that he would always bet, but I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking. I would tend to go the 75 here. If you go 150 and the low jack calls, you're probably beaten, right? Do you think?
Yeah, I think if the low jack calls, he might show up with a set of 10s here or something like that.
Did he check back on the flop?
I mean, he might just think that he's got the board crushed and he's not betting. I'm not sure.
That's like one where the board's like 10 deuce 3 rainbow or 10 deuce deuce. I don't know how many people are checking back here 10 9 7 with top set against 2 people.
if that's the case, then I don't know what. So you're saying, what if he has aces or kings or something like that?
I just think that you're not incentivizing anything worse for your hand to call here. So it's sort of protection value, which would usually dictate a smaller sizing to simplify it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fair point.
Mm-hmm.
I did run this through GTO Plus.
Mm-hmm.
And we could talk about that at the end of the hand if you want. But
Running
it
it
did.
multi-way?
No, I ran it heads up because GTO Plus doesn't allow
Right,
multi-way.
right. Well,
But yeah, so that's why I say we could talk about it at the end if you
because
want.
here's the difference between that though. If you're running it heads up against the guy who's in the who's the pre-flop raiser, which I'm assuming that you're doing in that spot, is that he has way more bluff catching call downs when it's heads up on a double drawed board, right? Even some ace highs. Whereas with this other guy in the hand, he can't call in the middle. So you got to be
Right.
careful about what these things output in the actual situation, right? So
Yeah.
okay, so you bet 150.
Yeah. I bet 150.
Uh-huh.
The low jack folds. And then the big blind does something very unexpected. He check raises me to 500.
Wow.
Yeah. So, like I said, I didn't. I assumed that if he had some kind of a value hand, like a set, like a straight, like two pair, 10-9, 10-7, he's probably leading out there on the turn. So I wasn't quite sure what to make of this check raise, unless it meant that he picked up. Maybe he has clubs also, or maybe he was check raising with spades. Um, I wasn't really sure. What do you think this might indicate from him?
I mean, it is a little bit. I don't know how competent the guy is, but it definitely is a little bit on the strange side for him to like go for a check raise here with a set. I mean, I guess he could have a straight. I mean, you have an 8 in your hand. If he was some sort of like thinking player where he thought that if you stabbed because it got checked through, he could put max sort of pressure on you. I just don't know how often he thinks that this is going to get bet off all that much. I mean, in general, it's still going to be way skewed towards value, but you have a hand where you can obviously call. I mean, you've got a boatload of equity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't thinking about anything except calling at that point.
Yeah.
Afterwards, I kind of went back and said, is this a spot where I should just be jamming? Because at his, he does have, 850 or so behind. So I think there's certainly fold equity, but I was like, I think I have too much showdown value at this point to turn my hand into a bluff.
So it's actually quite complex. The only time that jamming would be good here would be if he is doing this with enough draws where he's gonna call off now and he would give up on the river. So you grab the value now and he would just check and give up. I think that we can all get on board with the fact that if he is check raising a value hand here, he is never folding, right? A
Yes.
value hand. So,
Right.
So you call.
Yeah, I do call. Pot's about $1,200. And we go to a river, which is the 9 of diamonds.
So he has like what, 7-ish left?
He's got about 850 behind.
850. Yeah.
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 And that immediately all goes into the pot. So he jams for about 850.
Well, it's always interesting. It's not that I wouldn't bet a straight or if I played it this way, like Jack 8 or something like this, but it's live poker. And whenever the nuts change, so obviously the nuts here is a straight, right? Like a Jack 8, 6-8, like super thick value. If he check raises you and you call, I even though he only has 850, I'm peaked. My interest is peaked because a lot of players will not continue with the jam here. They'll sort of get scared, even though he only has like 2/3 pot size bet. And then you're like, and I said to myself, well, what makes sense here? Maybe he has a boat. And then I'm like, well, how often does a boat take this lot, like a non-set boat, which would be like top 2 or bottom 2, take this line of check raise turn? Seems bizarre. Seems like
Right.
it would bet. You block some of the boats as well. You have an 8 in your hand and all of the draws bricked out.
Right.
but you're holding some of the draws. So the pot's like 2,000. It's 850 for you to call. Um, yeah, I might call here just for those reasons because it's unorthodox. I just don't expect him to have 6-8 or Jack-8. And the reason why I'm leaning towards a call, of course, you block some of the boats here too and the straights. I've said that. But also, it's just, I don't know, like I said, how often these straights are check raised turn and then jam river, and I don't know how often sets are check raised on turn instead of leading out. So whenever it doesn't make sense and I'm getting a price, I kind of lean towards a call.
Yeah, your thought process is honestly what I was going through for about a minute and a half after he jammed, just calling back to like, does he check a set twice?
Uh huh.
And I was saying I really don't think that he's doing that. Does he check straight twice? Definitely not, especially with two flush draws out there. So I did end up calling.
Okay.
And he has King of Clubs, Nine of Hearts.
So
So
he
I
check raised the turn with just a nine.
with just the nine.
Wow. I mean, one of
Yeah.
the hands that we didn't go over would be 9x of spades. So if he had one of those hands that was a front door, I mean, specifically 9x of spades, which would have been like, and then he's taking that hand for a semi bluff, that would make sense. And it could only be 9x of spades. That's weird. Like, I wonder
Yeah.
what he thought he was doing on the turn.
I could tell you
Okay.
because this is somebody who I've played with a few times. We're not super friendly or anything, but we know who each other is. And afterward, about a half hour later, he kind of pulled me aside, and he's like, I thought you were full of it. He's like, I was just making a move there, and then I hit trips, and I'm sorry.
You know what?
And I'm like,
What's so interesting about that, though? That whole, you sort of get into the terminology of a recreational player that might not necessarily think through it. If he thinks you're full of it, how should he play his hand on the turn?
I'm probably just as a call.
Right. It should be. That's why it's so strange. And that's why when I do the commentary and I can see the card sometimes, I know that sometimes players have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
Because, okay, then play it like a bluff catcher. Why would you raise? If he thinks you're full of it, why would you raise? You know what I'm
Right.
saying? It would have been interesting if the river was a brick, what would he have done? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know.
he should be checking, right?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. But this one was unfortunate for me, I guess.
Yeah. Um, so anyways, I appreciate the call. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thanks a lot, Bart.